All right, maybe what we can do is if you would start, Robert, by just talking a little bit about how and why you got into organology in general.
Sure. Well, my path toward into the field of organology was not very traditional. I did not um, I did not follow a degree program in organology. I envy those who have. Uh, for me, it was more definitely more a situation of one thing leading to another. I do come from a musical family. I have two brothers who are professional musicians. My mother was a pianist and teacher. And with hindsight, I think something else that was obviously important, although I never really thought of it in that way, was my grandfather had a musical instrument store in downtown Detroit, and so on weekends, we would amble up into the attic of the store and rummage through all of the old flutes and saxophones and things like that. So that must have left a mark somehow. But I mostly studied performance. I'm a clarinetist, and I started out as a professional orchestral clarinetist, and did so for about 15 years or so. But early on in that time, I really felt like I was much more interested, and always had been much more interested in earlier music and in music history. I always thought that I had chosen the wrong instrument because I thought wrongly that the clarinet didn't really have much earlier repertoire, and I wished I'd chosen the lute or the recorder or something like this. But I met somebody who had a very um, important influence on the direction that I took after that. That was the keyboardist and conductor Christopher Hogwood, whom I had met years before. He was just by a strange set of circumstances, he'd become sort of a family friend. My brother, one of my brothers, had studied conducting with him, and so he sort of kept tabs on what I was doing. And when I expressed um, my frustration with some aspects of orchestral life, he said, "Well, why don't you take up early clarinet and come and play in the orchestras that I'm conducting in Boston?" Which I did, and I made a shift to playing a lot more early clarinet, period clarinets at that time, which was very, very, very important for me to have this experience of making contact with lots of other musicians who played early instruments, and Hallgood was definitely a sort of a role model for combining research with performance in some way. And so after that, I met the literary historian Jacqueline Letzter, who then became my wife, still is my wife, and embarked on a couple of research projects that also, one in particular having to do with women musicians of the 18th century, which was how I got very much interested in the history of the harp, which sort of replaced the clarinet for me as my main research interest. And so little by little, I did more and more research and teaching, and less performance over the years until 2005, when I was hired to be the curator in the Musée du Palais Lascaris in Nice, in France, which is where I still live, which is the second biggest collection of historical instruments in France after the collection in the Musée de la Musique in Paris. And at that time, the city of Nice was trying to create a music museum around this collection, which had been mostly in storage for many years. And so that was a fantastic opportunity, not only to work in a museum setting with historical instruments, but also to reflect on how best to create a museum around the collection. And that was so I did that for about a dozen years or so. And it was a project that had many ups and downs, and those ups and downs also, in some way, made me think about the importance of preserving instruments, and also how to communicate their importance to an audience, to a public. So that's how I got into organology. It certainly wasn't the traditional route, but I think for many in our field, it's also happenstance and opportunities like this that lead you in a certain direction.
I think so. And I think for our generation, that is particularly true because these sorts of organology programs weren't around
Yeah,
as much then. So um, the younger generations have an incredible opportunity to go into a handful of programs in organology, which is absolutely amazing.
absolutely,
So
absolutely.
I hope we can keep them all employed.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about your book then. Um, Particularly what led you to write it and what are you hoping that it does?
Well, I began thinking about it and began writing it actually during this time when I was working as a curator in the museum, and it was my experiences there that really made me think about the subject of this book. Primarily the experience of seeing people come to the museum and walk through these displays that I had spent so much time preparing, and the sort of disappointment that I had with some types of visitors, some who, for example, didn't seem to understand the point of exhibiting silent instruments in display cases. Um, Others who seem to appreciate instruments for, I don't want to say the wrong reasons, but different reasons than what I had imagined. If for a particular instrument that had a historical significance, to say, oh, isn't it pretty, or isn't its shape strange, or these kinds of things. But I think also maybe even more disappointing were sometimes the reactions of musicians who were sort of a prime target for prime audience for this kind of museum. Oftentimes, I found instrumentalists had a kind of a view that the instrument that they played, the model that they played, was obviously the most perfect um, example of their instrument, and why pay much attention to these kind of inferior um, examples that preceded it, and others that were outright angry that wonderful instruments were being kept locked up in a museum. So all of that was a bit disturbing to me, and more disturbing when I realized that instrument museums in Europe and elsewhere were often being threatened with closure, or even closed, because the people who were in charge of them were often, it seemed to me, not very good at explaining why the instruments needed to be preserved and exhibited. And it's not enough, I think, to appeal to other specialists who obviously value these collections, but I think we really do need to explain why it's important. So that was why I got into it. And then after that, I began teaching organology also, and realized that there was really no one text that I could use. Of course, there are lots and lots of wonderful books on the history of instruments and particular instruments, specific instruments, different subjects. But if I had to recommend one book that would explain to somebody why historical instruments are worth preserving, worth studying, that was something that seemed to be missing to me. And when I say that, it almost sounds pretentious, like I have some sort of very original and innovative approach to propose, but I really don't feel that that's the case. I feel that explaining that historical instruments are precious for what they can tell us about music that was made in the past is something that was known and appreciated, I think, but maybe has been a little bit forgotten um, in today's musical culture. For
So,
example, I'm sorry.
no, no, that's okay. Go ahead.
The whole early music movement that we call the early music revival really depended on historical instruments that were preserved in museums and private collections, and it's thanks to those instruments and lots of research on those instruments that the whole musical scene has been transformed by this historical performance approach. And I think today it's easy to lose sight of that. One example that I mentioned uh, in the book uh, about oboes, in fact, I think illustrates that point. When it was in the early 70s, I believe, that Nikolaus Harnoncourt was preparing his complete recording of the Bach cantatas, and one of the problems was that there was this instrument that one finds in Bach's scores, the oboe da caccia, that at that time nobody really knew what this was, and it was clearly an important instrument. It was in the Christmas oratorio and the St. Matthew Passion and the St. John Passion, not insignificant works. In very key moments, clearly a color that Bach associated with suffering and pathos, and it really something that was different than the normal oboe. But what was it? And at that time, the curator of the Stockholm collection, Kerry Karp, discovered two instruments, one in Stockholm and one in Copenhagen, that low oboes in F with a brass bell, which explains the da caccia, the hunting oboe name, and more importantly, stamped with the date 1724 and the name Johann Eichentopf, who was an important woodwind instrument maker in Leipzig and a member of Bach's own congregation. So there were two instruments that were then copied and used and recorded. A fabulous example of a lost voice, musical voice from the past that was then rediscovered thanks to these two instruments. But today, young oboists who study who play historical oboes can order copies of oboe da caccias from any number of makers, and it's just like something that was always there, but it wasn't. And so I think that's really one of the main reasons why I think it is really important to preserve these old instruments and to learn from them.
I love your point in the book about the historical timbre and the oboe da caccia is a perfect example of that. That the whole change in timbre of the sound, the color is completely different when you put that instrument into the picture.
Yes.
And we're never going to hear the piece the way Bach heard it, but having the the color that he was envisioning makes such a difference, and the whole topical nature of the instruments is a really fascinating thing.
Yes, absolutely. Because I think obviously we appreciate instruments and orchestration is important, and it's not that we don't pay attention to those subjects, but instruments are more than just colors of individual lines in a score. They are that, but timbre, as you say, has all kinds of meanings and associations that come with the histories of these instruments that one can learn about thanks to the instruments that have survived. A good example is the horn. Obviously, an instrument that comes from outside of the concert sphere, if we want to say it like that, from the hunt, from the forest, from all kinds of traditions that then were these instruments brought into concerted music, into opera, but they never lost these associations. And I'm not only talking about 17th century or early 18th century, even much later, even into the 19th century, these instruments clearly had these associations, and we have lost them today we don't hear horns, or most of us don't hear horns in the forest when we go out for a walk. But we are always playing this music from the past, and so we have a choice of either to forget about all of these associations and these elements, or to learn about them, and then it can enrich our musical experience.
And as you point out in the book so beautifully, the idea of a concert experience is, relatively speaking, a new concept. These instruments were part of people's everyday lives and part of just what they were doing from day to day. And um, if you understand the topical nature of them, how were they used in everyday life, you start to understand why a composer chose that instrument for a particular piece, and that
That's
really
right.
transforms it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And today, I think there's a sort of um, equalization of many instruments. Of course, in a music school today, one studies all kinds of instruments, and everybody follows the same sort of curriculum. And in an orchestra, everybody's paid pretty much the same. It's all sort of very smoothed out. But throughout most of music history, most of the periods of music history where we take the works that we play today, that wasn't the case, and we have horn players who spent most of their or much of their lives out on horseback in the forest. We have trumpet and timpani players who spent a lot of time on the battlefield or in ceremonial duties, and so on and so forth. And it goes for many instruments, that we have these different worlds and these people who had very different experiences that then came together to play music. And you have traces of this, vestiges of this today too, I think. But we just have to really to think about them. It helps to learn about these old instruments. But for example, even harpists today, if you go into any harp class in any conservatory today, you'll see that it's still over 90% women. And this is something that has a very clear historical um, um, explanation and a history to it. We have also double reed players, oboists, and bassoonists, who spend probably most of their free time scraping away at little pieces of cane. A completely different musical life experience than what a violinist or a pianist has today. And this has a very long history. And so all of these things we really can, I think, enrich our musical experience by learning about.
And this, what a great point. I hadn't really been thinking of it in this way, but in our era of equalization,
Mhm.
rightly so, what a fascinating thing to go back and look at. I'm thinking in particular, we have the payrolls from the Ferrarese court, and to note that the trumpeters were the highest paid employee of the court. That really tells you something about the role of the trumpet and the status of a trumpeter, as opposed to a lowly horn player who worked in the stable.
Right.
uh, yeah.
That's what I think is sometimes forgotten, is the role that these instruments that have survived, and there are very few of them, have in our understanding of music history. Because so often anybody can go to Wikipedia or open a book and see the history of the oboe, or the history of the harp. It progressed in this way, and here are some examples of instruments. But we only know that really because of these instruments that have survived. And when one goes into a musical instrument museum and sees all of these wonderful instruments, it can be sometimes overwhelming, and one can think, wow, there are lots of instruments that survive. But in fact, there are very few. And that's something that I try to convey in this book, that well, we already talked about the only two oboe da caccia that remain. But when you try to look at exactly how many instruments actually remain from the past, it's very, very few, even from the 19th century. If you compare the models of a certain instrument that we know about today versus how many we know were made, it's something like 4 or 5% that remain, and that's from the middle of the 19th century. And when you go back 1 century more or a few centuries more, there are whole categories of instruments for which we have no surviving examples. So it really is vital to preserve these instruments and fascinating to study them.
And as you say, we have, at least in the 19th century, only 4% of the instruments, and it gets fewer as we go back, but we have even less of the notated music as you go back in time because it wasn't notated. So the instruments that we do have are the carriers of the music.
Absolutely. And that is also one of the advantages, I think, of an organological approach to music history. When you look at a score-based or work-based approach, which can yield all kinds of other insights. But for example, with, let's say, the history of the harp, if you ask a harpist what is the history of their instrument, they might begin in the Renaissance with the first scores that specifically call for the harp, and then go into the 18th century with a certain amount of repertoire, and then lots of repertoire in the 19th century, etc. But if you look at instruments that remain, we can go 4,000 years back, and strangely enough, there are even more harps and parts of harps from ancient Egypt that remain than harps from the beginning of the 18th century in France. There are some weird anomalies of fate or of conservation that help us to understand parts of these histories of instruments for which, as you say, we have no scores. It's also the case for the flute. A lot for almost all instruments. We have for many instruments, I should say, we have examples from periods long before notation exists for those instruments.
But then your comment just now about the scarcity of harps in France from the 18th century raises another incredible point about the fascination of musical instruments is that, what was happening in France in the 18th century and how might the harp be connected to that? And which I think is a fascinating thing for students to think about because often we just don't think about musical instruments related to revolution. And the same can be said for French harpsichords. So why are they so few? And to get people to start looking back and connecting some of the
Yeah,
contextual dots.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is there anything else, Robert, that you wanted to have a chance to talk about?
Well, I think that the last point I wanted to mention was in terms of what I hope that students will get from the book is an appreciation for the history of instruments, their instruments or other instruments, as being very non-linear, I should say. That's often a misconception I think that people have when they're thinking about instruments for example, in a museum display, to look at them and say, oh, these are the ancestors of our wonderful piano or wonderful flute. There's always this idea that the current generation is somehow outside of history and that we've got the most perfect models. And what's funny is that when you read sources from the past, as you know, almost every generation, almost every century, you read our instruments are the most perfect in all. One cannot imagine a more perfect kind of whatever guitar or harp. And of course, history has a way of just continuing, plowing through. And so that is something that we see, and it's not a case of progress. That's that word progress of evolution. We often use those words in talking about instruments. And one thing that I try to show in the book, certainly in most chapters, is that as instruments develop, there are potentials that new potentials that arise, uh, but always or almost always with the loss of other kinds of potentials. We gain certain things, but then we lose the ability to do other things. And for example, with valves on brass instruments, when valves were applied to horns, for example, hornists were able to play and are able to play today chromatically with much more facility, and with the notes being very even in their sound, even in their timbre, and that is something that we can say is gained. But what is lost with that is the variety of colors that come with the stopped notes of a French horn putting their hand into the bell to change the pitch. And so we can gain certain things, but we always lose others. I always think of when I was little, I went to the circus, and I always have this memory of this clown who came out with a big basket of tennis balls, and he would do this thing where he would kind of bend down, and balls would fall out, and he would bend down to pick them up. And every time that he picked one up, there would be other ones that fell out, and that's the classic clown shtick. But it's, I think, same thing with instruments, that you gain certain things, but then you always lose other ones. And so with the valves, you gain certain homogeneous sound between different notes, but you lose these colors that were there before. Now, in at least by the late 19th century, it didn't really matter, because those kind of different colors for the different chromatic notes were no longer part of the musical language. And so it didn't maybe matter that those things were lost. That's often the case, that it seems like progress because the elements that one loses maybe are no longer valued at that new time in history. But the problem, of course, comes later when we want to play music from earlier times. What do we do? Because thanks to these instruments that have remained, that we've preserved, we see what we have lost, and do we use them? Do we not use them? That's very, very valuable to know what has been lost. Or the case with pianos that have become so big and powerful in volume, wonderful for playing in big concert halls, but they've clearly lost the ability that early square pianos, let alone clavichords, had to play very, very, very softly, whisperingly softly. A concert pianist today will say on their Steinway they can play so softly that it can be heard in the last row of a concert hall, which is a different kind of soft. It's a different kind of piano, but one cannot have both. So again, it doesn't matter perhaps to a late 19th century or 20th century pianist that they don't have the kind of clavichord soft volume, because we don't have those same kinds of musical practices of listening maybe with one or two people around one person playing a keyboard instrument. But that again is a lost musical practice that had a certain value to it too. So things do change. And I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind, is that it's not always getting better and better and better, but just changing and gaining certain things and losing others.
And that begs the question then, as these instruments have changed, are you then advocating that when we listen to a Beethoven symphony, we've lost something if we're not listening to it with those original instruments?
I don't think it needs to be that way. I think it always helps to know about the instruments from the past and what they could do. After that, there are different ways of doing things with different means. I think, for example, a horn player who is performing a Mozart horn concerto or the horn quintet or something like this, when you get to passages that maybe modulate into a minor key, and where with a stopped horn, you would have had that kind of snarly covered sound on certain notes. Uh, if you're using a modern horn that doesn't have um, that kind of sound, that stopped sound, you can still, if you know that those notes have those colors, try to play the passage in a different way, maybe using dynamics or using a kind of rubato or something, or changing the sound, the color a little bit with your breath or with your embouchure, something to try to achieve a similar effect, not a similar effect, but to at least knowing that was there, and then trying to communicate the sense of that phrase in other ways. And I think that can be done on lots of instruments too. But if you don't know that the passage was like that in the beginning, then it's just something I think that we're missing. One's missing as a performer, and then unfortunately the listeners are missing out on that as well.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. So, all
Uh,
right. Well, thank you so
Good.
much, Robert. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Allison, and look forward to being in touch.